Hello and welcome to the Pint Talks podcast, where two old friends chat about the world over a pint. In this episode, we discuss how COVID and the lockdowns have changed the way we do and think about work, both for individuals and businesses. We also discuss how things have changed in regards to automation and job outsourcing.
So today we want to talk about COVID and how it's impacting our work and our world. So to get us started, I figured we could start with like how has COVID impacted our jobs and our work. So I work at a technology company. I'm a designer, and COVID's impacted me quite a bit. I would say I still have a job, so that's been sort of the good part of it, obviously. So in some sense, I'm still doing the same job as before. So no giant impact. Some people are much more impacted. But the way I work has definitely changed. Typically, I'm an in-house designer, so I work with the same team in the same building with more or less the same people every day for years and years. And so now I no longer go into the office. I work remotely. So that's been a huge impact. I moved from going to work every day, having about an hour and a half commute. I live in Seattle. And then to just being remote, fully remote. I haven't seen my team in, 9 months now? So it's definitely been a huge impact in that sense. How about you? How's that impacted your job?
Well, not really, to be honest. So I'm a scientist and I work on disease detection. That includes COVID. So if anything, my work has become more. The one big change is, I suppose, that I am on my own sometimes, or I was during lockdown. I was on my own every day, all day in the lab. But I was, during the height of lockdown, I was considered an essential worker because I do research on COVID. So if anything, yeah, I've been lucky like you that I not only has there not been a stop in my work, but there's actually been an uptick. And yeah, that's generally how that went.
Well, so the workload thing is interesting because I would say like I don't know if I've had an uptick in my work, but the work is going on. I'm just doing it from home. So I definitely haven't seen any sort of a slowing of my work. It's, if anything, it's actually probably more accelerated because in some sense, I feel like, I don't know, when we're all working from home, I've noticed that, for example, people kind of schedule meetings pretty late. I never used to get like a 5:30 or a 6 p.m. meetings, on a daily basis. Well, I used to, I guess, occasionally get those, but kind of rare thing. Now it seems like that's a normal thing to do because no one has commute. There's always work to be done, so there's always like some need to have a meeting. That's like always critical, like 6 p.m. But when we also had to catch the bus as well, in the past pre-COVID. So normally people know that, okay, if 5 o'clock's your bus, you're not gonna really take a 5 o'clock meeting. So there was this sort of unwritten rule that you don't really schedule things like after 5 o'clock unless you absolutely have to. And so now I feel like, even though my workload's been the same, somehow the intensity has changed. And it's not necessarily because my employer is like pushing us more or something. It's just like the employees are scheduling calls, or like we used to have this thing called lunch break.
What is this lunch break?
30 minutes to an hour. And now it's just gone. It's completely gone. It's like my noons, I'm eating during working, or I'm not eating till like 3 o'clock.
So if I understand you correctly, it's like a free for all. Your work structure has kind of gone out the window.
Pretty much, yeah. Like the mornings are also out. It used to be like, okay, 9 a.m. is pretty much when you should have the first sort of a big meeting at the earliest, because usually people are in before that, but some people might not be. People that drop off kids and all that, and so typically we wouldn't do that. But now it's like, well, you could see an 8 o'clock meeting just because people are scheduling it. Has your work changed in that sense in terms of the structure of what you do?
Not really, because science is always it's usually very freeform. So you kind of do when you want, how you want, so long as the work gets done. People rarely ask questions. The only thing that is a little bit different is, we get meetings, obviously, because they involve multiple people, as meetings tend to do. So those were changed a little bit during COVID, because usually you have work meetings, and since I was the only one working, they turned more into um, social meetings like check-ins, etc. But that was the major change for me. Now the one other thing is that you're more allowed to work from home. Like it's not that you were forbidden before, but now it's a little bit, less, people mind less. But again, that's not a huge change.
So
But
you mentioned you're doing research on COVID. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing? And I guess also you talked how you work alone now. Like, is
mhm.
that normally how you did it before COVID, or was there like a different setting before COVID happened?
Well, okay, the working, it really depends on the project. So that it could be like you could do work with for 4 or 5 projects at a time sometimes, and it depends on the project. Now, what I meant by working alone in this case was I was literally alone on the whole floor, sometimes in the whole building. It was me and the cleaning crew. That was pretty much the people I saw all day. In terms of what research I do, well, we're into disease detection. So we work on rapid tests. And I've been working on rapid antigen tests.
And that's tests for COVID
Yeah,
detection
yeah.
test.
Well,
Okay.
technically, it's a test for SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus. Yeah.
So what's the difference with when I say COVID? Like, is there a
COVID
different
is the disease.
meaning?
COVID is the disease, and COVID is caused by SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus. So the difference is, for example, when you say a cold is a disease. It is related to several viruses. For example, 10% of common colds are caused by coronaviruses, by commonly occurring coronaviruses. So in that way, COVID, which is a type of pneumonia, is caused by SARS-CoV-2.
Sure. And is there like, don't want to dig too deep into this, but is there like a way of detecting COVID then that's different from the SARS to whatever the virus detection tests in general? Is there such a concept of detecting a disease?
Yes. So what you're basically asking about is, can you detect the disease versus the virus? And
Right.
in this case, sort of. Okay, let me just. So you have clinical detection and then you have laboratory detection. Clinical detection, you look at symptoms, you look at uh, clinical signs, and then that's the most common type of diagnosis. For a lab detection, you typically send a sample off. So clinically, COVID is very hard to detect because the most common symptoms are cough, sore throat, headache, fever. They're very common. So it could be a common cold for all you know. They're very hard to distinguish for other things.
Right.
And by the time that you have something more specific, you're already in a very advanced state. So yes, you could, but it's very difficult. Or you could detect COVID and not the virus, sort of. Uh, but
Okay.
it
So
is very
typically when we hear tests about COVID, they really mean tests about the virus that
virus. Yeah,
causes the COVID
yes, yes.
disease.
So
All
COVID
right.
is a
So
bit of a funny beast in this sense, because the disease is actually linked to the specific virus. When if you talk about flu or cold, that's a little bit different.
right, different in a way that multiple viruses can cause
Exactly.
the same disease.
Yeah, yeah,
So you mentioned you're essential, and that's why you're still working there.
yeah.
Are you essential because you're working on COVID tests specifically?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I was just really asking because the whole notion of being essential is a little murky to me. Of like who's considered essential. I'm certainly not, which is kind of straightforward because I can design from home. And then there's the other obvious cases where grocery workers or
Hmm.
doctors and like sort of firefighters, and you can imagine who the obvious essential people are. But then there's this group of people that are kind of like a little bit like you, like, are they really considered essential? Like, what does that status even grant you,
Yeah.
versus the rest of us?
Yeah, I've actually kind of followed a few lawsuits in there. So lawsuits are a good way to see to sort of chisel out or put better form around the laws that exist. And I've been following a few of those around COVID, and how exactly of what essential is. And I'm mostly familiar with the United States, right? And there have been several here. There have been one in Michigan, in Pennsylvania. There was now a big one in New York, which is going ahead, which was talking about, the definition of essential and essential business. And I think essential employee and business are sort of related. And so here, the big thing is that I don't think that there is any standardized version of essential. So it can mean whatever the specific location decides. So the essential in New York is different from that in Massachusetts or California or Florida, and it's probably different to that in France.
Right. So that's confusing, right?
It's
It's
very
confusing the
confusing.
hell out of me.
Yeah. So one thing I heard that they're doing in France, I believe, is that they are no, it was in Bulgaria, that they're forbidding big businesses from operating, like big chains, the closing down the non-food section, so the non-essential section, and they're allowing smaller businesses to operate on a reduced capacity. Yeah, so that was in Bulgaria that they're doing that.
Okay, so they're letting the smaller businesses on reduced capacity, meaning they deem them essential, but
Yeah,
not the big chains.
yeah.
So why do you think is that?
Well, they want to protect their small businesses because typically big chains are multinational, whereas smaller businesses are local. So if you want to get taxes, if you want to get more taxes and to keep the jobs local, you might want to protect smaller businesses.
Right. So it's an economic sort of decision. But
Probably,
but I
yeah.
guess when I think about in general about essential workers versus not essential is I think of the people that we can't really live without, right? We think about the people being essential. It's kind of different than okay, maybe the restaurants are open at 25% or 50%, let's say in
Hmm.
Seattle. That doesn't mean that they're considered essential. It just means like, okay, these are the rules now for restaurants. But essential workers are this separate group in my understanding that are just like the doctors and the teachers and all these, like it's a whole
Street
different category
cleaners.
of right. So I was wondering, like in your job, has your actual number of hours changed? Because like for us, I know that we did this survey at work and it showed that people are working longer hours than before. And for some reason, COVID has made us work longer.
For me, it kind of depends. If I am working from home, I'm awful at this. So I get distracted by whatever, and I think my productivity really plummets. Whereas if I'm in the lab, I'm actually more productive and might work longer because, especially if I'm alone, because I don't have anybody there. Usually I'm more senior. So people come to me all the time and ask me questions, etc. So if I don't have to do that, then it's much faster and easier for me to do stuff on my own. How
So you
about
work you
yeah,
work longer when you're at your job. Am I getting this
yeah,
right?
yeah. This has to do with just the kind of person I am. I just kind of find it very difficult to focus at home. So you might have a good day, but then there's a lot. Most of the time, I can't focus. And I really think this is kind of a personality. That I know a lot of people. This is a common debate which we would have had. And I know a lot of people which would prosper to work at home, and some that find it very difficult.
Well, so for me, it's been I'm definitely one of those people that prospers at home. Partially because the way my brain thinks. Past certain point, let's say I work, let's say 2-3 hours of focused work, I can't be focused anymore. I need a break. Maybe it's a walk. Maybe it's just like a short break. And sometimes at work, just because the way things are, you generally have less time. So because you have the commute, you have like certain, I would say even intra building commute where I have to go to another building to take a meeting. And so
Mhm.
usually I tend to have a lot less time for focused work. Just walking between meetings. I would say I tend to have less time for these breaks. And when I don't take these breaks, I lose productivity. and naturally, I have deadlines. That's kind of how I am sort of motivated to work through deadlines that are sometimes self-imposed, sometimes just the business requires them. I tend to work longer hours because if I lose productivity because of fatigue or whatever it is, I need to I need to make it up somehow, right? I still have the deadline. Deadline's not going to move for me.
Mhm.
Sometimes you can, but sometimes you can't. So then I feel like I'm more productive at home, and I work less, a little bit less, just because I take the break when I need the break, and I focus
Yeah.
when I need focus.
Well, for me as well, there's the other difference that the work I do in the lab and at home is obviously different, right? In the lab, usually I have when I go there, it's lab work, so do A, B, C, D, it's manual work. Whereas at home, it's to do with writing, reading, and things that maybe are not the most fun to do and take a while for you to warm up to them. So that might also be a contributing factor.
So would you say, okay, so I guess since you can work both in person there, going to your job and working from home, you kind of alluded that you do more of the boring tasks or hard to get yourself to do tasks at home. Is that how you kind of end up
It's not
splitting
by
your work, or?
choice. It's just I can't if I am at home. For example, there was about 2 weeks initially in the lockdowns when we didn't know, are they gonna close research? Are they keep research open? Who's gonna be allowed to go into the university, etc. So it was about 2 weeks there that I had to be at home because there was no real guidelines on anything. And the only thing I can do at home is do paperwork, read, write, that sort of thing, plan, maybe do presentations, but I can't do lab work. I can't actually go in and obviously bring chemicals in home, or nor would I have the equipment.
Right. So if you live in a world where you can make up exactly the portion that you work at home versus in the lab, what would you choose today based on what you've learned so far?
If I had an office at work and then I had obviously the lab there, that would be the best way because you kind of need to be there. If you're not, it gets complicated. It's mostly to do with other people being there. If I have somebody like a student or a PhD or whatever, and they can't find something, they can't do something, they're struggling with something, I need to be there to go and say, okay, now we do this, now we do that. Especially even more so for safety's sake, because sometimes there's something breaks.
Yeah, I mean, I can relate to that for sure. I think when I need help or I need to give someone else help on my team, it tends to be easier in person. For whatever reason, I don't know if it's like, my job is sort of digital. We work on computers, so we can still share quite effectively. You can share a screen, and I can see what you're doing. So I don't really need to be next to you, and yet it still feels like, with current technology, less. We work through, in our case, Microsoft Teams, but like it's sort of the same experience or very similar with other tools like Zoom. Um, you lose part of the body language. You lose part of the communication is a little bit chopped up, I would say. Where you're not really sure if someone's going to continue the sentence or someone else is going
We
to
start
jump
talking
in.
over each other.
Right.
Yeah. No, I
Like,
agree with you, and I definitely think there's a big difference in communication, and not only in you know it's not for me, it's not so much informative as in the information that you convey, but it is more to do with how you can personalize with people. And I think that would be one of the bigger changes for me now with working remotely. So not only because of COVID at the moment that we have to, but if more jobs go remote, I think that would be one of the major challenges for employees, where you maybe can't relate to the people you work with anymore, and not as much anyway. And you sit there at home all day, every day. You don't go out, because you're at work, and then you have to take care of dinner or whatever you do. And I think that, in my mind, that would be one of the major challenges with remote work.
so I think just on a couple of things there. To start unraveling it, I guess you mentioned being able to relate to people. I think what I'm experiencing with that is, if I've already built a relationship with somebody pre-COVID, I don't really have a problem with my connection to that person. Even though it's remote, they still feel relatively close to me. I can still talk to them, relatively the same way I've talked to them before. But there's the whole aspect to it where when you have new employees come in, or new colleagues, then if I haven't, I have a few team members where I have never met them in person, and I would say, I still get close to them, I still work with them, but it doesn't necessarily feel the same. It feels a little bit different. It's like you've never had those casual conversations together. You've never learned. I mean, you haven't learned much about each other outside of work. I think you learn a lot about those things just like when you meet someone in the hallway or the cafeteria, or
Yeah.
there's a lot more that I've learned about my colleagues that I know from the past in person. So I feel like that's been one of the challenges for me with like people I don't know particularly.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm more even talking, sort of trying to look at features and permanent changes that COVID will bring. And I think one of those changes would be more work will be remote, or remote work will be more common. So I don't know if you'll have entirely remote work, or just partial, or how, or it'd be a hybrid or something. But I think COVID has definitely stripped away some of the stigma related to working from home, because we've had to, like, companies have had to face that now. And they've seen that it's not that scary and that work still gets done, or at least that's what I've heard from various sources. I don't know. Do you know how your company is doing? Or are they preferring online? Are they looking to maybe continue remote work beyond COVID?
So, I work in the tech industry, and there's the companies are doing different things for sure. It still feels like there's not going to be one consensus. One thing that my company is doing is they've made it very clear that they do not want to, or in the foreseeable future, don't intend to do the way our CEO says it is, replace one dogma with another.
Hmm.
Uh, so we're not moving to remote permanently in order to, I don't know, save on costs or whatever. One thing that they've really stressed, and I think we'll see a degree to that in probably every employer or many, many employers, is there's going to be a degree of flexibility more, where you have the ultimate sort of a utopian version of it is anything that the employee wants will be available. So if the employee wants to work in person every time from any location they can go to, any office location, or if they want to work totally remotely from maybe even a distant country in a different time zone, they'll be allowed to do that. Now, I don't know to what extent that will be implemented. I think that's yet to see, both in my company as well as in the industry and sort of in the world as a whole. But I think we're seeing a lot more of these companies announcing certain flexibility
Mm.
that will kind of be, it's kind of here to stay.
Yeah. I kind of agree with you. I see the same trend that more flexibility is going to come up. What would be very interesting for me is if there will be different rules for different, let's say that you have two teams, and one team is only remote and one team is only there. And I'm purposefully putting two extremes. And if there will be different rules, like different metrics for how you measure their performance. Like, do you have, like, for example, for you, how do they measure your performance at the moment? Is it the same as it was pre-COVID?
It's a good question. Yeah, I
Of
think
course, it's a good question.
there's
I asked it.
right. You get one good, every two podcasts. Anyways, so yeah, I mean, the way I measure this, there's a number of factors that have been preset. That sort of, if you talk about sort of my performance review of, which is something I have to do twice a year, and generally, I go through a number of things that I've done throughout the last, 6 months, and I discuss with my manager, and they tend to, promote people based on that, or determine bonuses and kind of like give you feedback. If you talk in terms of that, that hasn't changed at all. It is the same things that are, I would say they're relatively standard, where we have things like business impact, collaboration and teamwork, effectiveness, speed and things like that. So nothing really has changed in terms of that. So yeah, I mean, I don't think there's generally going to be a difference in terms of that, because we still need to make, the business impact. We still
Mhm.
need to be inclusive and empathize with our colleagues and our customers and others. We still need to sort of show the same character and the same, work ethic.
Yeah.
But how you achieve that, I would say, will have to change, because it is going to be a little different. It's for example, how do you stay motivated will have to change, because if you're working remotely sort of your whole life, I think you alluded to this a little bit earlier, your whole life kind of changes, right? The whole dynamic of it.
Yeah.
You don't have a commute is different. You can work on different locations. That definitely changes everything.
I think one big change here could be if you allow to do a lot of people would move away from big cities, at least in my mind. Like if I had the choice of staying somewhere further away, maybe in a nicer place for the same rent and working remotely, I think that would be a good option.
So it's definitely hard for me to imagine staying in a big city. Right now I live in Seattle. It's hard for me to imagine staying in the city if I don't have to, work here in person.
Mm,
Just because big cities have a lot of issues, right? I mean, I can see it for some people, but some of the issues include, it's loud, it's expensive, the commute is insane, there's a lot of crime, so there's all kinds of issues related to living in a big city. Now, there's also upsides. Cities are very vibrant. They could show you a great, cultural mix. There's a lot going on. It's fun. Young people tend to prefer living in cities, and so I can see some people still really, or probably everyone, needing to find that in one way or another. The sense of community, the sense of meeting people and having fun. People will still need to be able to do that no matter what. But do we really all need to be cramped in these little super expensive apartments and have 2.5 hour commutes every day?
yeah.
I'm not sure.
I think no amount of nightlife is worth living in a 5 by 5 apartment in New York or something for like $3,000 a month. And I'm being
Depends who
hyperbolic.
you are. Depends who you are.
I'm being hyperbolic, but I don't know. For me, that's one of the things. I prefer having a little bit more space.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky thing, right? As a designer, I've always felt like cities are very inspirational. I feel more excited when I see cultural diversity. Sort of my nightmare scenario is to live in a suburb where everyone has sort of the same house, and everything looks the same. And there's a place where we live, and there's a place where we eat, and everything's super ordered. And that kind of order frightens me. So I kind of like the chaos a little bit that cities bring. I don't know. I might miss it. I'm not sure, but it's certainly, like you're saying, there's a huge price that you're paying with that. So
Yeah.
for some people, it might not make any sense at all.
I've definitely seen that there have been a lot of reports now with COVID, people moving away from cities, especially, I suppose part of it is businesses being lost or closed, and people cannot afford big cities anymore. And so it's not overly surprising because there's big cities have probably doubled or tripled in terms of rent in the last 10 to 20 years. Like in a few decades, they have increased immensely in terms of cost of living, and salaries have not necessarily kept up with that.
Oh yeah, for sure.
That's one thing that I would be very curious as well is with more remote work, will your salary be dependent on where you live? Like, would they be paying somebody who lives in the middle of nowhere cheaply less or not for the
So
same job? I mean,
there's interesting data coming on that. Certain companies have announced publicly what's happening with that, still vaguely, but for example, Facebook, they've announced that they would be adjusting people's salaries based on where they're living from. And that's really received a lot of backlash from some employees that are looking to move naturally,
yeah,
because they're the ones affected. But the argument for not adjusting salary is like, well, I'm doing the exact same work I did yesterday. I'm just doing it from Utah instead of from San Francisco or Menlo Park. Like, why the heck would you cut my salary by 30%? Makes no sense. And then there's the other side to it where, well, part of why your salary is so high here is because the cost of living is insane.
yeah.
And that's why we're paying this extra premium so that we can attract you to work for us.
So that's part of it, partially why I'm wondering. I even wonder if maybe small, maybe not big businesses, but smaller, medium-sized businesses would adopt a more flexible mindset to attract more talent, because you want, usually if you're not Google or Facebook, you may struggle a little bit to find the best of the best. So especially in computers and computer design, etc. So would some people say, well, we'll maybe pay a little bit less, but we'll allow you to work from wherever you want?
Yeah, I think it'll be a competitive advantage. I agree. And I think it even goes beyond sort of small businesses. They're having a hard time. I think any business that does not offer a degree of flexibility will lose from this. I think these will be the big losers because enough places are going to do that. The big ones are offering it. Imagine sort of the FANG companies or sort of the big tech companies where we're talking about Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Microsoft, or in such companies. If most of them allow flexibility, but just say one of them does not, they will probably be at a huge loss for talent because that's kind of the same thing that happened with perks where Google, I think it was sort of the first big company that started doing that. I mean, they started when they were early, but they offered free food. And now if you go to California, many companies have free food. Why? Because everyone really cares about offering free food and they feel like that's the best thing. No, it's becoming a standard. It's becoming a competitive advantage for Google. If you don't do it, maybe you would lose talent. So talents, I think they really fight for the top talent. So that's what I feel like. Just like free food, flexibility of where you work from would become one of those things that are sort of standard.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I wonder how that would impact the other jobs outside of the tech industry. Most essential work, if you think about it, cannot be done remotely. Like that's why that was, I think, one of their big standards for what is essential, what isn't. Can't do it remotely, then it
Yeah, if
would be essential.
it can be done remotely, it's not really essential.
Yeah.
So no point of exception in a sense. It will be important work, but not essential in the sense like you'll still be open no matter what the situation of COVID is.
There was a lot of, so I wonder how they will impact outside of the tech industry. Like, would you have a lot of, let's say, HR personnel or marketing people?
Oh,
Like,
so
would
the
they be
non-tech
remote?
roles. So I guess there's like a few aspects to it. Like first is the sort of the non-tech roles inside of tech companies, and then there's the non-tech companies altogether. Yeah, I mean, I would say a lot of them don't have to be in person. For example, my accountant doesn't really have to be in person. It's already actually, I feel like accounting was one industry that was already kind of going in the way of you can upload everything online.
Yeah.
They can kind of do the work for you. I mean, I still went in person for whatever reason. Maybe
You
because
like their company?
yeah, I love their company absolutely, especially since tax
Who
season
doesn't
is
love
coming
their
up.
accountant?
So you would see a lot of that move online. I think one thing that's been very interesting, particularly now when we're talking about outside of tech, is doctors, where I used to, go to the doctor's office, talk to the doctor, and the doctor usually, maybe if I have some sort of a condition, there'll be some tests that have to be done. So I kind of go through labs or, whatever equipment is needed to do the test. Then I see the doctor again to discuss the results. Then there's like a follow-up, maybe, like a typical thing when you have some medical condition. It could vary a lot, but for the most part, probably half of these visits don't require me to go in person. To talk over results doesn't have to be in person. Maybe the initial checkup, I can still see a value depending on what my symptoms are. The labs are not going to go away, but that's sort of a separate location. But I can feel like teledoc and other type of software, or just speaking through Zoom or something like that, can really transform medicine in a sense, at least in that aspect of sort of going in person. And that can maybe help create more access for doctors.
I think that would be a very big thing. That's one of the bigger impacts of COVID, maybe in the medical. Well, one of the impacts of COVID in the medical field in general are more remote diagnosis and more remote visits, doctor visits, which are okay in big cities. Usually, it's not a big problem, though. There's a lot of queues, and I'm sure everybody who's been to the doctor has been in a waiting room for hours. But more so from remote areas where you have to drive like an hour to go see a doctor, like in that way you would be, or there are very few doctors where there's a shortage, because
Man,
usually
even in the cities, we drive for an hour.
all right, point taken. But I more mean like in areas where there may actually be fewer doctors or less qualified doctors. If you need to see a specialist, that's not available everywhere. So that would be an interesting impact. Yeah.
For sure, yeah, that can definitely be one of the positive impacts, I guess, of COVID.
Yeah.
I want to circle back to a point kind of you made earlier about the non sort of these, as I described them, the non-tech workers in tech companies, like how they work. And I think from what I've seen so far, HR or most sort of workers, marketing, those, I think my company is pretty much operating, almost 100% remotely now.
Mm.
So in terms of, and we're not losing productivity based on the reports that I've seen. So it seems to me like if we have to, we can go fully remote, as proven by the current crisis pandemic. But do we really want to? Is another question.
Well, I didn't even mean like non-tech workers in the tech industry, but I meant like overall, even outside of the tech industry. Because a lot of companies have HR, a lot of companies have a marketing department, you know. A lot of, sadly, I think it's going to be one of those things that a lot of the white collar work will be able to be done remotely, whereas a lot of the blue collar work would be localized and you'd have to come in. Like that seems to be a trend to me. Because if you are, like, obviously there's exceptions, right? A doctor has to be there. It has to be a nurse, same thing. Scientists obviously have to be there, or at least a lot of scientists have to be there. Management, office personnel. I mean, why wouldn't they be able to work from home?
So what is the factor that would kind of drive that? Is it requirement to use certain machinery?
For
Is that going
example,
to be the key?
or where the task is. I mean, tasks can be located in specific locations. Like if you have to clean the street, you have to clean the street.
Right. Certainly when you're impacting the environment that you work in, as opposed to impacting a remote location, if I can abstractly put it so.
And for doctors, obviously, you have to be in a location where you are findable, especially for experts, you know, like
But
radiologists.
aren't you?
That
So
sort
what
of
do you
thing.
mean by you have to be in a location that you're findable?
You are obviously, as a doctor, as a nurse, you are required. So if people want need something from you, they can come and find you. For example, if there's a emergency, if there is a patient, something's happening to them, like maybe not all doctors, like general practitioners could possibly, but then there's a lot of things to do with patients have to come to you for diagnostics, right? You go in, they listen to your heart or they listen to your breathing, like that sort of thing can't really be done remotely.
Yeah, it seems like it'll take a really long time for that to be,
I mean,
to
unless you
to be
automate
done.
it, it's not going to happen.
Right. Well, but we're seeing some advancements in that, right? I mean, it's certainly off topic, but I have a smartwatch that tracks my pulse now.
Mhm. Those are
I mean,
not, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of problems with them because not smartwatches in particular, but that's kind of technology like pop medicine, which is it's not very accurate. So it
yeah, but
has a
it's only going to get
questionable,
better, right? I mean, it's one of those things
yeah.
where there's been a lot of problems with everything that starts first. I mean, it's kind of like cars, right? It's like first cars were terrible. Now cars are much better. We're still killing each other on the roads. And then at some point, autonomous vehicles will come and they'll be much, much better again.
And then
So,
at some point, we're going to be like the Jetsons flying on flying
well,
cars.
maybe, yeah, although there's challenges to that too. But, I
I
feel
was
like
joking. It was a joke.
with certain technology, like we might make some of these more possible. And I think
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
access to medicine at home is probably one of those examples that I
well,
see like
definitely,
as
yeah.
a possibility.
But not definitely not in the foreseeable future. Like one exception is surgeons. Some surgery can be done with robots, but they are looking to automate a lot of it, and not necessarily automate, but have surgeons remotely control robots because robots can have a lot smaller parts, so they can get in, do a lot less damage to surrounding tissue, fix whatever needs to be fixed without having to worry about opening big spaces so you can see inside physically. So you can use camera sensors and everything to measure a lot of stuff more precisely. That's one of the exceptions for the medical field. But yeah, that's mostly has to be you have to be there. So yeah, for majority of people, I think the remote work is not going to, and by majority of people, I mean the majority of people in the U.S. Remote work is not going to make a big difference because I think the majority jobs are in retail, trucking, and logistics, and that those jobs are not really going to be remote.
Well, I guess what we need to clarify is what time horizon are you talking about? Because with some things, they could be remote today. These are already the things that we're seeing being remote
Yeah.
during COVID, because whatever we could put remote, we've done it. But then is this also sort of the beginning of this digitalization or the acceleration of this process where we see a lot more companies start working on automating more and more things or remotifying more and more things?
Well, I wouldn't put it as remotifying. I would put it as removing. As in, if you automate a truck to drive itself, you're not the trucker is not driving it remotely. He's just not driving it. And it's the same
Well,
with
so that's
retail.
that's one example, right? But there's also the other thing. There's other things where you can just, like you mentioned, the surgery, right, where
Yeah.
you still use a surgeon to do it. It's just like extending that person to a remote location.
Well, yeah, but remote location doesn't mean at home. Because usually, you have to have good internet. There's still no, that may change with time. That could be changed, but at least for the moment, you need a lot of controls that need to be there, and you need to have reliable internet or reliable connection anyway, because you can't lose your connection halfway across into surgery, right? You have to have it fast, etc. So, at the moment, from what I understand about it, and I'm by no means an expert, it's the next room. But conceivably, with maybe 5G and other advancements like that, you could make it across the country. But you'd probably still need a terminal, at least for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, in that example, you can see that. I think, yeah, for sure, 5G is coming. Obviously, right? We're starting to see phones
Yeah.
shipping with those chips, so you'll see other devices equipped with those
Still
type of
not causing
chips.
COVID though.
Still not. I think there's going to be an acceleration of it. I think we've seen these trends sort of converging.
Yeah,
Like one trend is like, okay, now the world's not as afraid of trying things remotely,
yeah,
and then also we see things like 5G really kicking in. I have a feeling that this is going to it's just the beginning of
yeah.
seeing more and
I
more
think
things going that
with
way.
remote work, to sort of cap off that topic for me, remote work is something that was always coming, and a lot of this 5G and a lot of these advancements, Zoom, obviously was available. Everything was already in place for us to be able to do it, for people who can do it to be able to do it. And I think the one big thing that COVID did was really accelerate the process, like remove a lot of the stigma, a lot of the worries for companies because they had to get in it. I think that was the biggest contribution. It was a catalyst, not so much a cause.
Right. So we talked a lot about remote work. Are there other things that you're seeing that are kind of like, well, COVID changed this and probably maybe will have a lasting impact on it? And not that in a sense that it made it remote, but for example, we see airplanes get cleaned
Yeah,
all the time, and trains and buses and stuff and restaurants. And like we're seeing like a much better hygiene. We're seeing social distancing more broadly, obviously enforced. Obviously, some of that social distancing is uncomfortable and just
yeah.
enforced by COVID. But like, are we gonna see some of that stuff stick?
Funny enough, I think, yeah, I think some of it will, some of it, like the good hygiene and the constant cleaning, I think will not, because it's a lot of effort, and I think if people don't have to do it, a lot of them won't. But one thing that might stick around, which is very interesting, is the design of how workspaces are, from architecturally and civil engineering, from that perspective, how they're designed, especially hospitals, because COVID has transmitted through the air, not airborne, but through aerosol. And there's a lot of
Can you
research.
describe what the difference is, what between
Okay, yeah,
airborne and
okay.
aerosol transmission?
Airborne is small droplets which travel very far. So when you talk, you produce droplets of saliva and other bodily fluid, saliva, and they travel. There's big droplets. There's small droplets. The small droplets travel very far and can stay in the air for a while. And the big droplets typically are stay within 2 meters of you. So the closer you are, the more of them there is. There's been a lot of research as to the dynamics of those droplets in the air and how ventilation or the lack of ventilation can contribute to disease progression and infection rates. And that research is very interesting from the point of view of designing spaces. So restaurants, hospitals, etc. How do you set up ventilation of those places in such a way as to be effective that you can reduce the infectious rate of that location? So a lot of the inside outside, this is how you do it. Like a lot of those restrictions with COVID have to do with that.
So you think
And
we'll design buildings in better ways? Maybe some of the
exactly.
measures that were now like, oh, we should have designed this building in a
Yeah.
better way to
I
not
think
spread disease.
especially hospitals would benefit greatly because I've seen simulations of how these things spread in elevators, how they spread in rooms, how they spread with the location of the vents. So that would really impact work from the point of view of the building itself would be designed differently.
So one thing that really makes me think is this funny feature that Tesla cars have. That I forgot what it was called, but I don't know how much of a gimmick that is versus a real functionality. But they claim that their filters are great for. They have these amazing filters on the Tesla cars that are going to prevent from some sort of a exactly like a pandemic type of a thing, like a killer virus. So I wonder if that would that become like a standard thing on
I
cars, like
don't
a
think
super filters for
well,
cars, or is that just
typically
like
when you think about those filters, I imagine they filter the air that comes in.
right?
Whereas that's an odd thing because when the air comes in, it comes from a very low concentration outside, a lot of air outside, to inside where it will accumulate. Which I suppose I can sort of see it, the reasoning
So the
for that.
main thing you're saying is like the just to be clear, it comes from inside, meaning from people that are in the car, or
Oh no, sorry.
how would it accumulate?
Typically, you get infected when you have loads of people in an enclosed space that are sick. Well, not loads, but you have people who are sick in an enclosed space with poor ventilation. That's how
Oh,
you
I
get
see.
it.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Right.
So I
I
wouldn't
mean,
be
yeah,
so.
you're just contrasting outdoor places versus indoor
Yeah.
places.
So outside, it's not such a big problem because if you're 2 meters or more apart, especially with COVID, I'm talking about COVID here. It's not such a big problem because even if you pass somebody, you pass them for a few seconds, unless they're singing, they're not producing a lot of droplets, and it's very fast and there's a lot of air, so the concentration of the virus will be very small. Infection has to do with concentration of the virus, whereas for Tesla what is odd is if you are recirculating the air in the car, that sort of can have an effect because the air is in an enclosed location. If you have somebody who is sick and that air is continually being recirculated in that car, that the disease will stay there, and over time the air will become more infectious, so to speak.
Right, which is something that happens a lot during the winter, right? Where you
Yeah,
just recirculate air instead of bringing in from the outside because
yeah.
it's cold.
So in that case, that filter would could do something. But if it's bringing the air from the outside through the filter, that seems like a bit of an odd thing because usually that's not how this would go, unless you are driving through a diseased area for some reason.
Right, there's like a virus that's at the next
Yes,
level,
World
like a
War Z.
2.0, and it's just coming in from
Yeah,
everywhere.
so I don't know. But yeah, the main argument against those and the reason those are not standard is price, obviously. If you have clean rooms tend to have that kind of filter. Actually, I don't know exactly what the filter is because there's several different, but I imagine something like a HEPA filter. The clean rooms have them because the air there needs to be sterile. And they recirculate, and depending on the clean room, they have different systems, but they're expensive.
Sure, yeah. I mean, of course, price is always involved with pretty much everything.
Well, one thing that I'm kind of cautious about long term is in remote work is actually something we've been talking and hearing more about, which is depression, mental health, substance abuse, interpersonal conflicts, that kind of a problem. And I think that would be with COVID and with remote work. I think that would can be a bigger problem,
You're
or
seeing
bigger
it
than
is
it used to be
today.
before COVID, bigger than it used to be before COVID.
Yeah, if we talk about COVID's effect on mental health, it certainly feels like, especially for remote work, it can feel isolating. The more you stay at home and away from social interaction, you can be lonely, and that can obviously lead to depression and other
Yeah.
anxiety and other disorders. Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a big problem for sure. One thing that completely stopped for me, for example, was we used to do happy hours and other things with my team, just like team building,
Yeah.
quote unquote, activities. So those things are definitely done. Seeing friends is naturally a lot more scarce because the disease is
Yeah.
upon us. And just in general, like social activities have decreased like crazy. I mean, I can go to my gym, I can go to a coffee shop, restaurants. Like here right now, at the time of recording this in Seattle, I believe everything is closed for indoor dining. During these lockdowns, I mean, it's definitely had a toll on me, and I think probably has a much bigger toll on some other people as well.
Especially when you talk about mental health, that's already been in the US, that's already been a rising epidemic. And with COVID, it's gotten even worse.
Sure, yeah.
One thing
And
that I'm more thinking about is even afterwards with remote work, some of that flexibility is great because you can live cheaper, etc., or you don't have to move to a different country or depending on how remote or state. But also a lot of people interact, like you said, basically you interact with people from work, you go for happy hour, you get to know the people you work with, maybe that improves your teamwork as well. Whereas with remote work, be it with COVID or after COVID, I think that would be a serious challenge.
so for remote work after COVID, yeah, I think just like something that or before COVID, sort of the what did workers experience, before COVID that did remote work. Some of the people I've spoken to tend to like it, but those are usually the people that do it. And there's a hell of a lot of people that don't do it because they don't like it. Like my wife, for example, could never imagine doing remote work. She hates staying at home. She always wants to be outside. She loves going to the office and working with people and meeting people. And so, if she wasn't forced to stay home because of COVID, she was not going to do that for sure. While others, for example, I don't really mind it. I've quite enjoyed working from home. I still need that social interaction. I still need to meet people. I'm a social creature, like all of us. But what I find doing is, I feel like I can find it elsewhere. I feel like, work is not necessarily the only place you can find it. It could be difficult for sure, depending on where you live. And if you recently moved somewhere, I would say it can also be harder.
Yeah.
But probably different people will cope differently with this.
Yeah. Even for years now, that's been my worry about remote work. Because in a way, we are living in the most popular society and the most lonely society at the same time. And I think on one side, I can.
What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is we are a lot of people, but most people don't know their neighbor. And that's just sort of to illustrate it. Our communities are less developed, let's say. And I think people back in the day used to have a lot more, possibly because they were fewer, used to have a lot more community support. Whereas now we don't. Like I don't I for the last 10 years I've moved maybe, I don't know, 7 or 8 times, and bar one time I have not known my neighbors. Like not even known what they look like sometimes.
But isn't that the problem? Is because you move, I assume, in many
Work,
many ways because of your
yeah,
job. I
possibly.
feel like if maybe in the short term, it will be even. I guess I see it as probably even worse because you just lose that social interaction from work. But if you stick around in the same place, I think that's where you have a chance to really build a community and kind of get to know people. And if everyone is kind of living like that and we see less of this sort of nomadic life or moving, I feel like there's an opportunity there to actually build deeper communities locally.
Possibly, yeah, possibly for sure. And it really is, that's what I'm saying. Worry is it depends a little bit how things would work. Because if we go for a fusion type society, and here we're talking mostly about society, or I am talking mostly about society rather than individual jobs. I
That
think,
sounds creepy. Fusion type society.
yeah, I mean,
What is that?
fuse with the machines,
Yeah,
become
it's like
Cybermen.
a cyborg society of the
Yeah,
future.
yeah. Then Doctor Who will come in and have to save us. If we, depending on how society goes, it might present a lot more problems. And the other related point is also income inequality.
What about it?
Well, again, if you have remote work and you pay less for that remote work due to, you have more flexibility, they don't need to pay you that much. How will that
So
contribute to income
it
inequality?
was I always felt like that's going to get better because if I'm doing that remote work, and then I'm really talking more of sort of the immediate future rather than really long term ramifications because it depends on how site develops. But like if let's say I live in a rural area, I have internet, but that's about it. There's no companies there, there's no jobs, not a whole lot anyway. And I get the opportunity to get a remote work with one
You
of the
got no
top
trouble.
companies in the world. Well, that would be great, right? Like if I get a remote work with like a top company, like they might still pay me obviously according to my area because my standard of living like or cost of living is lower, then they'll pay me less, sure. But that might still be much better than not having a job or having a local job that is not of that caliber.
True, but what happens is then let's say that you are Facebook and you put all of your engineers, and I'm just picking Facebook because it's a large multinational. You're picking all of that can do remote work, and you get all of your engineers remotely, and not necessarily outsourced in terms of gig economy and temp jobs, but really they are your employees, your responsibility, etc. My guess is what will happen is they'll get their employees from countries which are generally cheaper. They have to pay even less. But the flip side of that for Zuckerberg and for the management team of Facebook, for the upper echelon, would be that they will probably not, like, the company productivity will not change, the profitability would not change, just the amount of they pay people would change. So sure, those particular people would be paid something that they weren't before, maybe even higher than they would have been if they worked in a local industry or for another company. But Zuckerberg and the upper echelon will get much more of the pie compared to now.
Sure, but isn't this like a what you're describing, sort of a win-win situation
I mean, yes and
where
no,
both
because
both the business and the employees win? Then what's
yeah,
the problem with that?
well, yes and no, because A, the jobs may be exported to another country, which would be a problem for the locals who would have otherwise had those jobs. B, it would be a secondary problem for the locals because you would have now people without jobs and people who are very rich, very, very rich and getting much richer. So in the location, you would get a lot of income inequality. So it's a win for the workers that are remotely. It's a win for Facebook and it's a win for the management team, but for the local society and possibly for the US national society in that sense, if that becomes something that happens very often, like that might be a problem.
So it kind of goes back to the reason of, why aren't they doing it now? And now meaning pre-COVID. Like why wasn't this already happening at a scale? And it was happening to some extent.
Hmm.
Naturally, like all these big companies, they have offices all over the world and in places that are, like India and China and Mexico,
Yeah.
where they definitely pay less for their workers than they'll pay in places like developed worlds like the United States and Western Europe. But why weren't they moving everyone already? And I think part of the answer is technology, because it just wasn't, the tools weren't as good. Part of it is time zones, just because if you work for the US market, for example, there is certain advantage to having workers in the same time zone, which Mexico does fall in that time zone. But I mean, like for example, India is totally different time zone, so that does introduce a challenge. But why is that? Would the reasons why they weren't going all in on this still remain
I
after
don't.
COVID?
I think now, obviously, it's a complex question, complex answer. For me, one of the main reasons is culture and the way things are done. So you've established this is how we do it, and that's how it's done. And change for a large company comes very slowly because you have to change a lot of people's minds. I think that is a big part of it. And that's the same with remote work. So the question becomes, well, if you're already hiring somebody in Utah to do the job for you, why not somebody in Ukraine instead? And if
So
you,
there's certain challenges, right? Certain challenges. I mean, the reason why they weren't is one of the reasons is talent. I mean, the US has great universities and produces a lot of talent. Just if you talk about the quantity of talent, it's not very easy to. I mean, Ukraine is just, could be any country, but Ukraine
yeah, I
is, I
mean, I
guess, a
just picked
cheaper
Ukraine as
remote
the,
place. Not
yeah.
to pick on Ukraine, but could be any country. But essentially, they don't really have enough workers to supply the US. It's not very easy to find workers that are in proximity with each other, that sort of can work together in the same
But
place. That are that many.
why do you need workers' proximity with each other?
Well, I mean, that's a whole nother sort of kind of worms of why you would, why you wouldn't. But like we discussed, for certain jobs you need them, right? Whether
Yeah.
it's equipment or whatever it is.
Yeah.
For design and engineering, I mean, there are certain productivity arguments that you can make for it. Like getting together, working, collaborating in the same place. There's definitely arguments that can be made about losing some of that productivity if you work remotely.
I mean, sure, but that kind of goes to remote work itself. So just also to clarify,
Sure.
we're not necessarily only talking about the tech industry. This is applicable to any industry which does not require you to be there and can be remotified, so to speak. So we're just using the tech industry as a proxy for because you work in it, you're familiar with it. So we'd be
Yeah, but there's certain other things, right? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's good clarification. We're not really talking just about tech industry, but it's something we think about a lot. So we're going to pick on the tech industry. I work in the tech industry, and we all sort of freaking live with it. But there's certain. So for example, there's the accounting argument, where if you hire 100 people that all live in the same city versus 100 people from 100 different countries, your expenses will be insane in terms of just managing that whole thing with salaries, with laws, with labor laws, with holidays. You will lose immense amount of, and that's an extreme example, I'm understanding, but
Mhm.
I'm just trying to exemplify, sort of give an example of
Yeah.
what will
No.
happen. So some of that exists for sure, where companies don't really want to. The same as in the US, they don't want to set up a shop in every city. They want to set up hubs because hubs are cheaper, because of all these accounting issues. There's like expenses like HR and accounting related that have to do with managing more locations.
Because I think for me, the point is, if we were talking about remote work, then the question becomes, like we said before, okay, why somebody in Utah but not in Ukraine? And then from that, okay, I accept part of that is laws, part of that is you need some, maybe a team to be, it would be preferable to be close to each other. And you could have some lack of educated workers, so with the proper skills. However, I think we can agree that the world being so large, there being so many people, you can find those people pretty much in all over the place, right? I'm sure in China there's huge clusters, in India as well, Brazil, like a lot of countries would have those workers, so that are relatively cheaper compared to the US. You just create a cheaper office in, I don't know, let's say New Delhi, as compared to San Francisco, or even a small city in India or in China, or in Kiev, for example. Like, why not move a big part of your projects there or to other locations if you're going
So
to
I
do
think
everything remotely?
some projects might move, right? I mean, just like they have been moving
Yeah.
for the last 30 or so years. We could see an acceleration of that for sure. I think there's many different factors, and it really depends on what industry you're talking about. So I think some of the factors are, I mean, I don't want to go into all of these, but essentially regulation is one of them. So if you do certain government work, there are often requirements around citizenship and location of both your workers as well as your data, for example, or like financial institutions, hospitals, that type of work. There's a lot of industries where there is actual compliance and regulation that forces you to act locally, to have to hire local workers. So that's one factor against that would prevent some of these jobs moving as well.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, there's like a number of reasons, but I don't think, you know, just thinking about this, reflecting on the whole thing, I don't think there's a clear cut answer of what's better versus, you know, not, or what's possible and not possible. I think also when you say, well, it's easy to find people everywhere, or it's possible to find people everywhere, I think people exist everywhere. That doesn't mean
They
it's easy to
certainly
find
do.
them. You know, it's not doesn't mean it's easy to find them.
I don't know.
Finding is actually establishing credibility, making sure these people are legit, that they have certain education. You know, doing a background check to someone in India, like I don't even know how I would do it. Versus in the US, there's infrastructure for how I can submit such request
Yeah,
and get
but
that done.
to be fair, that is relatively simple to do. We just hire them for 6 months first. Like, actually, most countries don't do background checks, to my knowledge at least. Like, I've never had a
Well, in the
background
United
check.
States, we do certainly, right? Every
I
time I've
know
gotten a
that's,
job, I've gone
yeah,
through
that's what I
background
was
checks.
gonna
So
say. In the US, you always get that, or at least to my knowledge, you always get that. But in a lot of other countries, you don't. And all they do is say, "Well, okay, we'll hire you for 6 months, see how it goes. And if it goes well, we'll give you a permanent gig, or that may be a year or 2 years."
well, you clearly understand what's the challenge with that, though, right? If you lose 6 months of productivity potentially, you lose all the money and all the time, and so that's not necessarily the most efficient way to do a background check, is to hire them for 6 months and see how they do.
Well, sure, but I don't know. It's really a U.S. culture thing to do background checks. Like, because you've always obviously have the interview. Like, through the interview, you would have seen whether or not they're okay. That's the point of the interview. So, and that's why you have their CV and everything. So you've already vetted them. So then, on top of that, to do a background check and make sure that everything is correct. I don't know. The U.S. is very militant about that sort of thing. I don't even understand why as much.
I think for the reasons that I listed, is
Oh,
just to avoid fraud naturally, right? I mean, it's because people lie, and you know, it's kind of a human nature. You know, I'm not arguing that it should exist or it shouldn't exist. I'm just saying it does exist for whatever reason, and you know, there's reasons for and
fair.
against it, but
I
it
mean,
is a thing that it will prevent this now. It is today preventing this as well. Just like I would say, I would even zero down on the background check itself so much. My point is not about the background check. My
mm,
point is about verifying that people are not lying what their credentials are and who they are. It seems like it will be harder if you work with countries that you're not physically located in, that you're not as informed about.
I suppose it would be harder, but you're also saving a lot of money on not paying somebody, I don't know, 150,000 a year dollars. If you're paying them a third of that or less.
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's certain costs. I mean, there's definitely huge savings if you can extract the same productivity. Then I think we would have all lost the jobs by now. All of us work in the US. I think capitalism, the way it works, is sort of the strong survive and the weak die in terms of businesses. And so I think it would have been like a no-brainer if there was no regulation and no compliance and no these reasons that we talked about that prevent it from happening. It will certainly be like,
Yeah, so one aspect I think is what that would follow from our conversation would also be um, new or changing business models. So instead of maybe having your full staff remote, a lot more work could go in a gig kind of format where you have a platform through which you hire temporary employees to do specific tasks rather than having somebody on staff.
so do you mean because sort of the gig workers or workers that are temporary kind of like independent workers that are hired as opposed to full-time employees are
Yeah.
more
So
likely to be remote? Is that
yes.
like how would that be a stronger adoption?
Yeah. So I think if you are starting to move towards a more remote work schedule, one of the things we're discussing is if you can you may not be able to get your permanent workers remotely or not as remotely, but one of the things you could do is hire gig workers remotely from different countries, and in that way you cut a lot of the problems that you were talking about. So for example, you're developing a mobile app and you want 10 characters for a game or something, or just for the app, and you just hire somebody through a gig platform to do those 10 characters for you.
You can, yeah, that we can definitely see a lot of that. We've already seen a lot of that. I mean, just definitely hiring a lot of temporary workers to be remote. I think we saw that before COVID.
Yeah.
Um, Go ahead.
Do you think that would be accelerated by COVID?
It's a good question. I don't think necessarily it would. Yeah, I mean, you could see that, as people became more comfortable with remote workers, then they might look at who are the current remote workers, and there's a lot of remote workers that are sort of this freelancers or people that tend to just work independently and just do like individual gigs for companies. So you might see some of that accelerate. I don't see, or I haven't seen any data to back sort of a move away from permanent employees overall, because to do great work you need certain continuity. So I don't think companies are going to really jump towards these gig workers or these temp workers as opposed to the permanent workers that they have, just because building relationships, building a team, and then building a great product out of that or service, I think is still going to be just as relevant as it was before COVID.
Yeah, well, I disagree, just to disagree then.
Typically,
Okay, well, to sort of cap the whole discussion, do you have any major takeaways, like winners, losers of the whole COVID and the future of work?
well, I mean, it's just my whole impression of it is that we'll keep having accelerated adoption of technologies that would enable us to do some of the things that we did today. I think a lot of companies started today in response to COVID, and I think some of these companies are going to become bigger and bigger companies, whether it's about remote work or about hygiene that's cheaper, or about connecting people and building communities more easily. I think we could see some of these stay. I think we'll see definitely society transform in some ways. I think some of the stuff that you said about the people decentralizing, moving away from the cities, I think we might see some acceleration of that. And just because currently we were all sort of pushing pre-COVID, we were all pushing towards cities. I think you might see definitely a more permanent slowdown of that. If not moving away, we could see a slowdown of the growth of the cities. So, only time will tell of to what extent is this whole thing gonna stay in terms of the way we work and the
Yeah.
way we live.
I mean, there definitely is an interesting point about the future of the city itself as well, separately. Because one thing that happened in New York in the first lockdown in April was that a lot of the rich people moved away or went to live in whatever villas they have away from the city, and they were working remotely. So the city itself lost a lot of revenue, could lose a lot of revenue from taxes from rich residents. I think that is something that we can talk about in future podcasts as well, the future of the
Sure.
city. For me, I think everybody lost, obviously, with COVID. People who, I'm not sure how much we have winners. Certainly, people who are Amazon and companies like that, like big tech companies, are the big winners. in terms of work and profits from COVID, especially Amazon. I think a lot of obviously the common worker, especially the low wage worker, was the big loser in terms of the ones who the retail, again, those ones who are not essential but did need to be there, like they were furloughed or just let go. I mean, Disney itself let go, what was it, 28,000 people who worked in its parks because they couldn't open. And those jobs, again, cannot be remote. Entertainment in general will, or organized entertainment like big studios, big blockbuster movies, like they would struggle, I think, in future as well. With that, we should conclude maybe.
Sure thing. Thanks for listening in, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. If you like what you heard, don't forget to rate us, like, and share. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram, where we are at Pine Talks. From the whole Pine Talks team, we hope you have an awesome day.